You're a fucking idiot. This needs to stop. Now.
The next station will be Fortuna 69.
I know what you might say.
Universal medallions shouldn't affect the Conclave, because that would then make the grind that Conclave players did completely null and void. If we did this grind, so should everyone else.
That's a flawed and nonsensical excuse. First of all, universal medallions only drop from disruption missions. Secondly, universal medallions have a 5% drop rate from rotation C, meaning they're fucking rare, meaning grinding them would be just as, if not more time-consuming than grinding the Conclave. Thirdly, universal medallions only give 1,000 standing each. The point of having universal medallions be able to affect the Conclave was to give an option for players who don't mind grinding for Conclave standing without having to play Conclave, because, as everyone knows, nobody plays Conclave. If anything, universal medallions would have been a bigger grind than Conclave itself, because you would literally need 372 universal medallions to get to max standing, which sounds simple, until you remember that each medallion has a 5% drop rate. This would have been a completely insane but reasonable grind for players not interested in spending hours looking for a Conclave match to take, but this got shot down because Conclave is apparently better off being more abandoned than Evolve. Anyways, it should be pretty fucking obvious to everyone that Conclave is dead. You can say that Warframe is a PvE game, which is technically true, but that would easily anger the very small minority of players that actually touch Conclave, let alone actually care about it. I mean, it is true for a reason. Conclave isn't mainline because Conclave isn't PvE, which isn't the primary focus of Warframe because progression isn't revolved around fighting over players. Much like how we joke about Zephyr Deluxe being delayed indefinitely, reworking Conclave is something that people like to joke about on account of Conclave being, well, basically abandoned. However, I do think that it's completely possible to morph Conclave into an interesting game mode for players to get into, while at the same time still somewhat being a PvP mode. This is something I briefly talked about in the previous video. The core issue with the Conclave is that there's literally no point to really try it, unless you care about cosmetics or Conclave exclusive mods. Again, remember that Conclave isn't designed as the focus feature of Warframe, because Warframe never was and never will be a PvP-oriented game, so it kind of makes sense why there isn't really anything quote-unquote good to obtain from the Conclave besides the Celestius Eye and Ana. In addition, Conclave has its own balance and meta, because Conclave has its own mods for players to obtain and use, not to mention that some Warframes have completely different abilities within the Conclave, such as Ivara. However, this isn't really the main topic of discussion. Nobody plays Conclave because it has its own grind, it has its own little meta and mods, and it's isolated from the rest of the game just because it's PvP. So, how could this be resolved? Well, the simplest way to get people to play Conclave would be to change it from PvP to PvEVP. You could instead also make it so universal medallions affect the Conclave just like the name universal implies, but that one guy on Twitter ruined it for everyone else, so honestly that's not an option at this point. Anyway, the reasoning for this is pretty straightforward, since Warframe focuses entirely on PvE content, extending PvE gameplay to Conclave would make it somewhat relevant within the game. Because Conclave has its own balance and meta, it can also be prone to having bugs, but they might not be fixed as frequently as mainline content bugs are, purely because again, nobody plays the Conclave, therefore either nobody really reports those bugs or DE simply doesn't care about the Conclave having bugs, because again, nobody plays the Conclave. Introducing Conclave in a new PvEVP format would not only get the rest of the community interested, but it would also revitalize the Conclave without having to completely remove it like raids were. Considering that Warframe was inspired by Shadow of Mordor when they made the Kovalich system, I wouldn't be surprised if Destiny 2's Gambit game mode served as inspiration for a PvEVP game mode.
This is Gambit, an all-new hybrid game mode for Destiny 2 Forsaken. Teams of 4 in separate arenas. First to kill the boss wins. But you don't fight each other. Not yet.
Obviously that's merely hypothetical, because Gambit has more than its fair share of problems. But what's important is the idea of it. It's still PvP content, but it doesn't immediately allow players to fight each other. However, because Warframes are designed with PvE in mind, balancing them for PvP is more often than not usually described as whack. For the sake of convenience, this hypothetical PvEVP game mode will be referred to as the Battleground. So, what exactly would the Battleground look like? Well, given that Warframe is strictly an objective-based game, the Battleground would essentially consist of two teams of players racing to complete objectives as fast as possible in a set amount of time, until they face their own unique boss together, and then proceed to fight the other team. However, because we as the players are usually able to speedrun through content thanks to having Riven mods and teammates with Riven mods nearby, players wouldn't start as a team right from the start. I know that sounds a bit confusing, but trust me, the Battleground is still at its core two teams of players facing off against each other. I'll go ahead and explain. The Battleground is a game mode that has two teams of 4 players fight each other in a race to see which team can complete their objectives as quickly as possible before being allowed a chance to kill the other team. Each team is dropped into its own tileset, but each player of each team is locked in separate rooms, each of which has a different but randomly generated objective to complete. Player 1 of Team 1 might be dropped straight into an exterminate mission, while Player 2 of Team 1 might have to complete a spy mission. However, as a twist, the first 4 players to complete their objective spawn a random debuff on the other team, which can be anything from increased enemy resistances or radiation hazard, similar to how sorties work. The point of the Battleground is to be the first to complete all given tasks, which is why it's encouraged for players to be as fast and efficient as possible. This means that, if a team is fast enough, they can spawn all 4 debuffs on the opposing team. That sounds unfair, but keep in mind that a team's objectives are completely individually, not as a team, meaning that the success of a team relies entirely on the individual proficiency of the players. It doesn't matter what objectives each player gets, because the point is, each player of both teams would have their own objective to complete. Forcing each player to go solo temporarily in a team environment encourages them to have a sense of urgency, and this creates a sense of competition between both teams. Regardless of what objective each player is given, both teams have a time limit for all players to complete their 4 individual objectives. If a team fails to complete their objectives before time runs out, the opposing team is given 4 random buffs, which can be anything from increased power strength to increased energy regeneration. Once all players of a team have completed their objectives, they are teleported together into a completely separate room which would have them fight a high-level boss. When I say high-level boss, I don't refer to something like the Sergeant, I refer to something like the Wolf of Saturn VI. Those of you who played the first season of Nightwave might remember how annoying he was to fight, and that's entirely the point. A team might be able to breeze through all 4 randomly assigned objectives, but they still have a boss to kill. The first team to kill their boss would then be teleported to the opposing team's tileset, but all Warframe powers would become disabled, both for winning and losing team. At this point, it comes down to pure gunplay. Both teams face off with standard weaponry, and whichever team is left standing wins. Both teams are equally rewarded with standing, credits, and any other associated rewards. However, the players of the winning team are each given a 10% buff to all reward gains for the Battleground, which can stack up to 100%. Although winning 10 Battleground matches in a row is not a simple task, it is still possible. This would encourage players to keep going back to the Battleground, in order to maximize the amount of possible earned rewards. All of this of course requires balancing. To address this, the Battleground would have 2 modes, casual, and competitive. Casual Battleground would allow players to jump in as either a full squad or as random players. Both teams have a time limit of 5 minutes to complete their objectives, and Riven mods for all weapons are disabled by default. However, both teams may vote to enable Riven mods, and if both teams agree, then Riven mods may be enabled for all weapons. Competitive Battleground would be for full squads only. Both teams would have a time limit of 5 minutes to complete their objectives, but parkour and all movement-related abilities such as vault speed are completely disabled. Riven mods for all weapons are disabled by default, but again, both teams may vote to enable Riven mods, and if both teams agree, then Riven mods may be used for all weapons. Of course, there are plenty of other things to go into, such as matching up random players with other players of similar mastery rank. Given that this entire game mode is strictly hypothetical, that's a bit irrelevant. The overall point here is, Conclave does not have to be ignored as it is currently. It could be so much more if it were converted into a PvEVP format, which would not only breathe life into a forgotten aspect of Warframe, but it would also give players a chaotic but potentially entertaining new way to play the game. Thank you for watching.